As we continue our series on communication for nonprofits, we're joined by a guest whose work involves working with mission-based organizations on crisis communication. If this is something you've never thought about for your organization, or you need guidance on managing communication around a crisis, then pick up a cup of coffee and join us.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Good morning and welcome to Coffee Time, a 30-minute conversation with leaders of mission-based organizations. I want to welcome our listeners here in the US, Australia, and around the globe. And while you're here, please introduce yourself in the comments and let us know where you're joining us from. My name is Peta Blakely, and you are watching Coffee Time. I'm joined today by my co-host, Cynthia Rojas. Good morning.
Hi, Peta. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm excited about today. Not a topic we talk about too much, so.
No, and probably not a topic that we talk about enough. This is the kind of thing that, like, once you realize you need it, it's probably too late to start figuring it out.
I love that. I love that. You know what I think about when I think about crisis communication? I think about Olivia Pope. Did you ever see that show,
Yes.
Scandal?
Yes.
I can't wait to ask our guests if it's anything.
All right, let's bring on our guest.
Yay!
Carissa Cunningham is a longtime nonprofit communications professional specializing in legal and legislative advocacy, LGBTQ rights, criminal justice reform, and public health. And today she is going to be talking to us about crisis communication and her experience with crisis communication in nonprofits. Good morning.
Hi to both of you. It's nice to see you.
How
it's good to
are
see you?
you?
Thank you for joining us.
I'm very good, thanks.
So, I mean, you commented before we started the show that in the year 2020, every organization was in crisis.
That's right.
Whether they knew it or not. Talk a little bit about what constitutes a crisis and how do you know you're there?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. My experience is that organizations tend to either overestimate a situation they're in and think it's a crisis when it's really not. And when people are in that situation, they're in danger of turning it into a crisis because they're very emotionally engaged with it and may over-respond. Or on the other end, being in a state of denial and not knowing that they're in a crisis. A crisis is different from like the daily things that go wrong in an organization, you know, that somebody says something mean on social media about you, or that your website goes down for an hour, or, you know, things of that nature. Yeah. It is an operational or other issue that is a threat to your organization's reputation, operation, or even existence. So it is important not to push the panic button. But before you get to that existential crisis, there are things you should be doing to contain. So people often think a crisis is somebody did something wrong in our organization. There was malfeasance or sexual harassment or embezzlement or whatever. Many crises have nothing to do with anything you did. The pandemic was one such thing. I know that every organization operating in Southern Manhattan on 9/11 was in crisis. I mean, the entire country was, but they had to communicate in specific ways. So it can go from large to small. And, you know, part of what I do is help people assess where they are. There's kind of a matrix or a escalation framework for communications. And a great deal of my job is helping people to put it in perspective and therefore to right size their response.
Yeah, right size their reaction.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you haven't lived it before, right, it's probably very easy to overestimate how important it's going to seem to other people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think especially for mission-based organizations where we're all, invested in our jobs in a very, personal way. And it feels really bad when something is going badly inside your organization and is threatening to go public. So that sometimes leads people to over-respond.
Do you have an example of an overestimated, I think you called it, when we overestimate that we have a crisis and we really don't?
Right. So I recently had a client who was having a leadership change, and a leadership change is an ordinary thing that happens in an organization that is stressful and that does require special communications, but it's not necessarily a crisis because we know that leaders leave. And this is somebody who was leaving for a good job, but he was leaving in the middle of a capital campaign. And the board felt it was a crisis. He didn't feel it was a crisis. And a lot of his senior management didn't feel it was a crisis either. And that was an occasion where I felt like it's on the cusp and they are in danger of communicating crisis to people by communicating.
And it shouldn't be a crisis, right? I mean, if you have planned for this and other people are ready to step in, it's not a crisis. Right. But if you start to communicate like, oh no, this is a big deal, people will question the depth of your lineup, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, often my advice to people is to look at the plans you have already. And this fits within the framework of those plans and of your capital campaign communications and your leadership transition communications and so on. So that was one of trying to get people to contain it and treat it as ordinary as it was.
Yeah.
So sometimes you're working, and it sounds like this example, with the board, with the leader, with the senior team. I mean, you can end up working with quite a few people within the organization to help them through this process.
Right. And one really principal thing about communicating during a crisis is everybody needs to get on the same page. We all, the board and the leadership need to agree about what's happening here, need to have access to the facts, need to agree on what the messaging is, and need to agree on who the point person is and who the spokesperson is, so that we don't have numerous people, saying different things. And so sometimes the job is to quickly get everyone on the same page, and organizations being what they are, sometimes that's complex. But in a crisis, it tends to focus people's minds on working together.
Yeah. How did you get into this work? This is really interesting. And I would imagine working with organizations that think or are in a crisis is heavy work. It's heavy work.
Well, it's really interesting because I have been an in-house communications director for most of my nonprofit career. And I started not as a director, but as a young, PR worker bee at an organization in New York called Gay Men's Health Crisis in the 80s. And it had the word crisis in its title. And it was the height of the AIDS epidemic in one of the cities where, that had the greatest prevalence. And also that was a media center. So we were, it was a great crucible for me. I mean, in a lot of ways, politically and personally and professionally. And I learned a lot about communications. Later on in my career, I became a communications director and dealt with a few crises from that position. And then as a consultant, I have to say, Cynthia, when you say it's heavy lifting, it's much heavier lifting from the inside. From the outside, I have I have a perspective that the insiders don't have. I don't feel as terrible as they do. And that it really helps,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So a lot of my work is keeping people calm and giving them perspective and getting people to agree to a plan so that nobody goes off the rails.
Yeah. And, that is one of the best things about consultants, right? Is we have, I think Cynthia told me this, we work in as many companies in a year as most people do in their careers, right? So this crisis that this organization is experiencing for the first time, you might be walking through for the fifth or sixth time.
Right.
There's some patterns, there's some predictability about it, and your ability to be calm there and say, like, people have survived this before.
Yes.
It's so helpful and important, right?
Yeah, exactly. This one is not an existential threat.
Yeah.
But there are things that you could and should be doing.
Yeah.
And so who are we communicating to?
That's such a good question.
Yeah.
Because one thing that often gets overlooked in crisis communications is communicating with your staff. Your staff are some of your most important ambassadors, especially in mission-based work where people are embedded in a community that they're serving. They are out there communicating about the work, whether they're officially deputized or not. And so, one of the first tasks is gathering the facts and making sure everybody has the facts, and giving people the messaging, helping them understand that they are not the official messenger, but this is what's going on, and this is what we're saying. So for nonprofits, their important audiences are their stakeholders, their staff, their donors, public officials, because most of us either get public money or are a presence at the State House lobbying, and so on, and sometimes the general public.
Yeah. There are many audiences. Last week, Peter and I we started the kickoff for the series, and we talked about the multiple audiences. That's an exercise that I think nonprofits should do at least annually.
Right.
To just reassess, are we talking to all of our audiences, whether there's a crisis or not? Just who are the people that we need to speak with?
Right. And in a crisis, it is good to stop at the beginning and ask yourself who needs to know and why, and make sure you understand, because you may be communicating differently with people who need special handling. You may be broadcasting to other people.
And what do we want them to do with this information?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Where I can see how participants of your program might have a different interest or may not care about the federal obligations of your funding. That would be over communicating. They care how it impacts their lives.
Right.
Where our political leaders that advocate for us in Washington might want to know what are our plans to that funding that they fought so hard to get us. So I can see that. I can see that. So even what if a nonprofit has an internal communications person? Do they still need someone like you?
Sometimes they do. And it may be a matter of capacity. It may be a matter of experience. It may be a matter of just needing that outside eye. I think that the people that have done crisis communications for half of them have had internal communicators and half of them hadn't. And the ones that don't are the smaller, the small scrappy nonprofits who don't have time to usually even make a regular organizational communications plan, let alone plan for a crisis. So what I try to give them is not only the guidance through this particular experience, but a template for crisis communication, so they have an idea of how it's done going forward.
Mm.
And how helpful is it to have a regular communication plan, right? I mean, to develop a crisis communication plan, are you doing that work? Are you doing what do we tell people on a regular day, and what is our messaging first?
Yes, you could be, because sometimes in a crisis, for example, I worked during the pandemic with a community health center who was getting some criticism online about how they were providing services during the pandemic. Yeah. And in fact, they were doing everything right, but they were a little bit freaked out because this person was threatening to go to the media, which is a legitimate thing to be concerned about.
Yeah.
And I am forgetting what your original question was.
How helpful is it to have a communications plan before you need to develop a crisis communications plan?
Right. And they had no communications person, and they had no communications plan. So a great deal of this was new to them.
Yeah.
And this was one where the board and the executive director were not necessarily in harmony at the beginning. So sometimes, I think you both know, as consultants, sometimes it works to your advantage being a consultant, where people are like, this is the expert, everyone listen to her, which is nice. And it tends to happen sometimes it tends to happen, I found, more in a crisis than at any other time.
Right.
But it also teaches people some of the fundamentals. And one of the things that helps you if you have a crisis is if you have already been communicating regularly, especially with media, if you already have relationships with people, if people already have people who may be reporting on you already have a good opinion of your organization, and you can reach out to them. So that's why one of the reasons why it's important to be communicating regularly in non-crisis times.
Yeah, right. Right. I mean, you create a kind of baseline, right? It's easier to return to that baseline, rather than to let that negative press be the first time anybody hears your name.
Exactly.
So I love that you talked about you started during the AIDS epidemic, and I remember that time really, really well. And I lived in New York at that time as well.
Did you?
And so I would imagine communicating now is a lot different. Before we came on the show, you talked about social media. Back then, we didn't have social media. We relied on the news, who really controlled what we heard. And so that has its pros and cons. And social media is just everywhere. How has that complicated your work?
It has complicated my work. I mean, I started in a time when we actually wrote press releases and put them in envelopes and put stamps on them, and they arrived in a newspaper. What? Now, if you're not letting people know immediately on Twitter or via other platforms what's happening, they think you're not doing your job. And it definitely is the case that crises can spread more quickly, and that your response time needs to be quick. It has always needed to be quick. Ever since there was a 24-hour news cycle, even with cable TV, it has had to be quick. But now it needs to be even quicker, while at the same time, being truthful, being complete, having integrity, and all of that stuff. And the other thing, just the mainstream media has changed tremendously. There are there's not as much local news coverage. There are not as many people who specialize on a beat. So there may just be fewer media people who actually know your organization, and they may be hearing about you for the first time in a crisis.
Yeah. How about, do you do work internally? What if the crisis is internal? So Peter and I talked about external communication versus internal. What happens when the crisis, and I can't think of an example, you might have one, but what happens? Do we still need you when there's an internal crisis?
Well, I would say a lot of COVID was an internal communication crisis.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I mean, you may or may not need me. I mean, there is a sort of crossover when it's entirely internal between like HR and communications. And with bigger organizations, they have HR communications, which is, different from other communications. But man, that was a situation where information was changing rapidly and where, people had to figure out what they were doing day to day and make decisions that changed from day to day. And so communicating was both very important, but also I think really frustrating because you were dealing with changing information that you didn't have control over.
Changing information and changing modes of communication. You couldn't just be like, hey, everybody come to the conference room, right?
Right.
You had to figure out how to tell.
Absolutely. And for me, as a person who also does media relations, one of the things the pandemic changed is that reporters don't work in the newsroom anymore. And so if you don't have their cell phone number, you're going to have a hard time reaching them. So, there's that additional layer of difficulty. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you should always think about your internal audiences, whether it's something that is in danger of, jumping to the outside world or not. And in most kinds of crises, I really do believe your staff are very, very important, both for their own morale and because they are communicators.
Right. So what I'm starting to hear is there's like a continuum between reputation management and crisis communication.
Yeah.
Right. And that the crisis communication is extreme reputation management. But if you are doing that all of the time, that helps.
Yes, it absolutely helps. You've built your reputation for integrity, for truthfulness. And again, with mission-based organizations, I also encourage people to have a plan and have messages that are consistent with your mission and your values, because a crisis is an opportunity to build your brand. And the way you handle a crisis and the way people see that you handle a crisis can communicate something about your brand and about your values. People should always be truthful. People should always be empathetic when communicating, and also, think about the communities they're most closely connected with.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Cynthia.
I love that. I love that thought, and wondered, do you also work with leaders or work with the person who's doing the communication? This became very, very obvious during the pandemic when we watched the leaders of different nations communicate. And there's now so many articles that have been written about empathy and, compassion. And we also know that states and countries led by women fared better in terms of less deaths than those with men. And I just wondered, is that also an important part of the formula, the coaching, in how you deliver the information?
Yes. And again, ideally your executive has had coaching before a crisis, but if not, some of what you need to do in a crisis is select the right messenger. And it may be that your CEO is not the right messenger. Like, I think we might agree that during the pandemic that Dr. Fauci might have been a better messenger than President Trump, for a lot of reasons.
A lot of reasons.
He expresses empathy. I mean, he's knowledgeable. All of that.
He wasn't just making things up.
It's not always the CEO, but that that formula of you have to take responsibility. You have to be empathetic. If there is some kind of tragedy, the first thing you say has to be about people who were harmed.
Yeah.
And if you have made mistakes, you have to acknowledge and own those mistakes. So, that's all important.
Yeah.
And who the
And all
message
these, I mean, all of these subtle things. I remember once hearing the district attorney for Boston, I guess maybe that would be Suffolk County,
Mhm.
saying that she never, ever, ever allows herself to be caught smiling at a crime scene.
Yeah.
Now she's seeing some people and she might be saying, "Oh, congratulations on the birth of your grandchild," because
Right.
this is the first time she's seeing this person since that event.
Yeah.
But somebody has been killed here and
Yeah.
that person's family is going to see you on the news.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
right? You have to keep that in mind through
Right.
this entire scene, right? And that is the kind of thing that I think without coaching and training, people might not always be aware
Right.
of and might inadvertently make a terrible mistake.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What is your game face? What is your demeanor? What's the, what are the visuals in which you're
Right.
delivering the message?
Okay.
And all of that stuff is important. Yeah.
That's a lot to think about.
It is a lot,
Yeah.
which is why
Right.
it's good to prepare.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much to prepare and to practice in advance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And also why a leader might just say, like, I am not the person to do this. And leading from not necessarily in front of the camera is a great way to lead. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it can communicate organizational strength if, it could be that a leader opens a press conference and then turns it over to the person on their team who is the expert in this area. It shows that you have depth and you're working with people that you trust who are experts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I worked with someone like that. And so this person spent their whole lives running a crisis program. And so she's just a wonderful speaker. She never she's just steady Eddie. Nothing startles her. Nothing. I was speaking with her recently and asked her where do you think this comes from? And she says, years of this work. Never overreacts. You can't push her buttons. Just steady Eddie. Best at it. And so she often did a lot of communicating on behalf of our agency.
Yeah.
Yeah. She would be in demand.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is awesome. So what one or two things that leaders should be thinking about or they should not do when there is a crisis in terms of,
Yeah. I think that the most important things is to know what the facts are. That's one of the most important things, to the extent that you can gather facts as quickly as possible, because you don't want to have to backtrack. You don't want to go out there saying something that is not true. I think taking responsibility, aligning with your values, remembering your staff. And then I have other do's and don'ts, like don't act unilaterally. Like, you need a crisis team. You need to quickly put together a team of people who need to be involved. Don't be defensive. Don't appear angry. Don't act angry. There's a lot of people feeling angry. And to the extent that you can maintain positivity, and by that I don't mean saying everything is fine or everything's going to be fine, but use it as an opportunity to communicate about the things that you are doing to address the situation.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say thank you. We were so looking forward to this episode because it's something we don't talk about or think about until we're in it.
Yeah.
And then Peter says it's too late.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's the takeaway from this. It might not be too late.
That's right. It's not too late. It's not too late.
Right.
And if you don't have communication staff, and if you don't have budget to hire a consultant, there's stuff online you can read. There's webinars. There's templates. Even that is helpful for you to fill out the form, like, who would be on my crisis communications team? How
Right.
would we communicate? What are our important organizational values? And what are a few likely scenarios? Because you can't predict all the scenarios,
Right.
but
Yeah,
think about a few that are possible.
right.
That's awesome.
Good. Carissa, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is something I love talking about.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
A great weekend.